Australia's 13 new deep state corrupt targets. Martin North, John Adams, in the interests of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir. And before we start today's episode, may I say happy birthday for this week, sir?
Yeah, our birthdays are very close, aren't they? It's interesting. It must be something about the time of year.
Yes. All I can say is if people don't know, my birthday's on the 20th of September and Martin's on the 21st. So we're only one day apart, which is fascinating given that we only met by happenstance.
Yeah, it is interesting. Maybe that explains our outlook on life, John, and our cynicism. I don't know.
Could be. Well, Martin, we have a very interesting show. It's going to be relatively short. But Martin, can I say I was very fascinated with the response to our last show where we talk about the rating statistic of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. The show has received a lot of comments. It's gone viral. We've had a lot of people wanting to tune in to understand about how we're going to bring down the corruption that's endemic in terms of Australia. And I think by judging of the comments, there's a lot of people who share our view that the country is headed in the wrong direction. Public policy has been pushed in a direction that I think a large section of the Australian people don't support. And obviously, particularly when it comes to COVID-19 pandemic management and a few other things, people out there do believe that there are public officials and they have abused their power that has caused harm to thousands, if not millions of Australians. So I think we've touched a nerve here. And what we're going to do in today's show is actually go through the new NACC statistics, which only came out today, which indicate that there are more corrupt targets that the NACC has identified. And obviously that means that as we go forward in this journey, the chances of more corrupt public officials are being targeted and investigated and potentially prosecuted increases.
Yeah, so another 13 this week, which puts the number, even higher, of course, than last week. And on that trajectory, and assuming it continues, they're going to have a vast number to deal with in due course, aren't they?
Yes, in terms of so I think the volume was quite large in terms of the statistics we pushed out last week, and although we presented last week. So I think the new statistics that we're going to show this week shows that more and more people are coming forward, more and more targets who are within the public service are being identified as potentially corrupt. And obviously, hopefully that could make certain people who have been hiding the public service quite nervous, because the great thing about this process is that referrals can be made in protected referrals can be made in confidence. Some of them they can also be made anonymous. And one of the interesting things, Martin, is if we could put slide 1 on the screen, we had this week Adele Ferguson at the ABC report about a person called Richard Boyle. And Richard Boyle was a former public servant in the Australian Tax Office who had deep concerns with some of the operating tactics that the tax office was implementing on the small business community. He attempted to raise the alarm bell within the ATO, tried to do a whistleblower disclosure. His concerns were dismissed. So controversially, he went public in 2018 with Four Corners to tell the truth of what the tax office was really doing and how their disproportionate tactics were having a harmful impact on the small business community. And because of his participation in the Four Corners program, but also he did take some confidential taxpayer data because he needed to demonstrate to, fun enough, Adele Ferguson, when they did the story back in 2018 about certain allegations, the fact that he took taxpayer data with him to his private residence is actually a criminal offense. And so this person who tried to do, in his view, the right thing by exposing the real truth of what was happening inside the government, he was raided by the ATO and the federal police. He has been criminally charged, and now he's attempted to argue that he was a whistleblower with immunity. The the court early this year has dismissed that defense. And so he's now facing potentially more than 45 years in jail because he wanted to let the public know what the government was really doing behind the scenes. And so, we have this real big tension as to who is a whistleblower, who is not a whistleblower, what is the right way to raise concerns when things inside the government don't go so well. And obviously, if you're trying to do the right thing and tell the truth, will the system protect you or not? I think one of the big differences between where Richard Boyle was in 2018 compared to today, we have the National Anti-Corruption Commission. So if you are a public servant and you have raised concerns up the management line about certain individuals or certain practices that you think are either unethical or illegal or potentially corrupt, and your management team doesn't want to hear your concerns, you now have a legal mechanism to go and have those allegations tested rather than having to risk your life and your career by going public to the media. So I think the NACC is going to hopefully assist people like Richard Boyle into the future. But obviously we have this situation where he is due to face trial, and he's in his, I think, 30s now. He may not be out of jail until his 70s, which is a tragic consequence for someone who just wanted to tell the truth.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? And the fact of the matter is, until NACC was there, people would be very reticent because, of course, if you get on the wrong side of this, you could actually, as you say, get put into jail. But NACC is now really reshaping the behaviour of the public service, isn't it? Because they have an obligation, not just a right, but an obligation to actually highlight corruption if they come across it.
Well, yes. So that's a concept, Martin, that we touched on the last show. So there's a small group of people who do have a mandatory obligation, and it's the people at the top of the system. So your pedestrian public servant doesn't have a mandatory reporting obligation. But obviously, if it goes to the secretary or the commissioner of taxation or the chairman of ASIC, for example, if they become aware of corruption, they have a statutory obligation to send that to the NACC for investigation. But obviously, as we said in the last show, in terms of Parliament as well. And the other important aspect, Martin, is that it's not just public servants who are captured in this NACC net. It's also people who are on government contracts. And obviously, one of the big focuses this year has been the big four accounting firms in terms of PwC. So if you are working for the federal government on a contract and you have engaged in conduct which is corrupt as per the definitions of the legislation, you could also be investigated by the NACC. And so given that PwC has been referred to the NACC, the PwC issue is going to be looked at closely. And this whole issue of consulting firms and government contracts and what must be done is a very murky area which hasn't had a lot of scrutiny. And I've worked at a big four accounting firm. You've worked in consultancy as well. And there is a lot of pressure placed on consultants to produce an outcome that senior public servants, in terms of what they actually want. And without going into names, all I can say, Martin, is that in the last 48 hours, I actually had the honor of meeting someone in the Wollongong area who used to work at a big consulting firm, and he worked on a government project which involved public safety, and the government wanted a certain outcome to be delivered in a particular report. He refused, and he was very senior in this. He was relatively senior in this organization, and he basically told me one day he was taken for a walk by someone at the top of the of this particular consulting firm, and he was told point blank, if you want a waterfront mansion in the ritzy suburbs of Sydney, you're going to falsify this report, because if you don't, we're going to absolutely destroy your life. And that person basically just said to his superior, go jump. I'm not going to falsify any report. I'm not going to do anything that's going to lead to potentially people dying. and his career was destroyed. He lost his job financially, but also mentally and emotionally. It's been a very rough journey over the last couple of years, and now this person's found a new mechanism to be able to continue some of his important work and continue his career in a whole different field. But it was just a fascinating conversation I had with this person in the last 48 hours, where the way it works in Sydney, and Martin, can I tie this back to the property bubble and the broader economic state? So if you're living in Sydney, for example, and you're living with very elevated property prices and you have a massive mortgage, it's very easy for people to be able to put pressure on you and say, if you want to get into the property market, if you want to live in a good suburb, or if you have a mortgage and you want to keep your house and you want to continue to meet your mortgage repayments, we need you to cut some corners. And this is a conversation that some person had. It was in the last 2 or 3 years that this particular example happened. But dare I say, I think this is a set of behavior which would be happening right across the country. And obviously, consultants who are being engaged by public servants to produce specific reports that are engineered to deliver a particular outcome that politicians and public servants want. There are sometimes ethical consultants that are willing to stand on principle, and then in terms of those cases, they may suffer a heavy price. But there's plenty of other people who, in terms of basic financial needs, are willing to look the other way.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, John, isn't it? Because as people do get themselves potentially more leveraged, it means effectively they're more exposed, particularly if things go wrong. And on the other hand, if there's a route to more wealth that they can create relatively quickly and effectively simply by towing a particular line rather than not, in that context, they might well do it. It takes a certain type of individual to hold on to that moral compass even when the financial pressures are really building.
Indeed. Now, Marta, so we're going to go quickly into the new statistics that came from the National Anti-Corruption Commission today. We're not going to go through the broad explanation of the NACC and the definitions of corruption, given that we covered that in the last show. But Martin, if we quickly go to slide 2, what we can show that this week we basically had, after 11 weeks of the NACC operating, we're now up to 971 referrals. So if we go to slide 3, what does that mean? It means that in the last week, we had another 63 new referrals coming from the public. And fun enough, some of those referrals that happened last week, particularly late last week, were a direct result of our program. I had spoken to certain people who had various concerns about historical cases of what they thought was corruption. And so given our show and given some of the conversations I've had with people privately, they felt compelled to make a referral to the NACC. And one thing I would say, Martin, is that if people are listening and they are aware of examples of behavior with either public servants, politicians, or people under government contracts that meet those definitions of corruption, now is the time to come forward and obviously raise your concerns, because the more people that actually engage in this process and the sooner that process or that participation happens, the quicker we can actually help drive fundamental change in Canberra, but also across the country by having a ethically clean in terms of public service.
Yep. So make every opportunity, take every opportunity, and there is a mechanism, right? And I think it's worth underscoring, John, that although there are some things you do have to put into a submission, the submission itself doesn't necessarily have to be massively long and massively complex.
Precisely. If you use the National Anti-Corruption Commission's online webpage, they have some simple boxes and they have some limited character spaces for the explanation of what the scenario is, who the public servant is, why is this particular allegation or story corrupt. So there are what the NACC is looking for, and I've spoken to some of their officials on the phone, they're looking for a very basic story so they can get their head around as to what is the basic allegation. And then from there, they're happy to go back to people and request further information. the alternative is that if you have a lot of documents that you think is well worth sending to the NACC initially, you can send that through the postal service. They are receiving hard copy mail every week, and they take those documents and they scan them into their system. They're obviously processing those allegations as well. Now, Martin, if we go on to the next slide, so of the 971 referrals that the NACC has received, so this is something that we covered last week. So we have making a referral, we have the first stage assessment, which is, can you identify a public official? Can you identify an act of corruption? And then we go to the second stage assessment, which is whether they will investigate, how they will investigate. And then you go to preliminary investigation and then to a full investigation. So what we've been able to identify is that, so we talked about a backlog because of this increased volume. So that backlog has continued to increase. So of the 971 referrals, this week, 238 referrals have yet to be touched. So obviously the volume continues to grow and the backlog is growing. And dare I say that as more people continue to flood the system with ever more allegations of corruption, that backlog could easily increase. Now, in terms of our first state assessment rejection rate, so if we go on to the next slide, Martin, what the NACC has identified this week is that the rejection rate has gone up from, I think, 43% to 48%. So out of the 971 referrals, 352 referrals have been rejected at the first stage because they either weren't able to identify an act of corruption or a Commonwealth public official. So compared to last week, I think it was 310 that were rejected at the first stage. Now it's 352. And then if we go on to the last slide, Martin, is that, so here's our snapshot for in terms of this week. And these are statistics that basically are for the close of business of the Monday, 18th of September. So we have 159 referrals, which are currently being considered at this first stage assessment, and that's up 9. We now have 158 referrals at the second stage, and that's up 13, and that's where the title of the program comes from. And what that means, Martin, is that so the NACC now has 13 new additional referrals where they have correctly identified a specific person, and that specific person has been correctly accused of an act of corruption consistent with the legislation. So I think this is one of the hardest things that people are finding so far is, can you identify a specific person? Can you link a specific act of corruption to that person? So as of now, about 1 and 2 are failing to achieve that basic task. But what the NACC has said this week is they have 13 new public servants that have been accused of, that have been correctly accused of corruption, and they obviously will now have to ask the question of how will they investigate those particular allegations. And the other one big thing that came out this week was they've increased the number of formal NACC investigations from 2 to 3. So when we looked at this in the last episode, we said there was 8 formal investigations, 6 legacy and 2 new. Well, now we have a new formal investigation. So there's 3 new investigations in total. And so the process continues. And obviously, these statistics indicate that the workload of the NACC is increasing. More and more allegations are coming forward. More and more targets for investigation are being identified. And it continues to be a very interesting process as we go forward, what will happen with the NACC. I think, Martin, there are some people, if we look at the comments of the last show, there are some people who are hopeful that something positive will come out of this process. There are some people who are skeptical that this will deliver nothing, or it will deliver very little in terms of actually cleaning out, in terms of what they perceive to be the real corruption. But again, if you look at the headlines, everyone's talking about The Voice. There's protests all over the country and rallies either for The Voice or against The Voice, and people are getting very nasty about this completely wasteful exercise that the polls are saying is going to fail. And yet the real story that's happening behind the scenes is more and more members of the government are being identified for corruption. and obviously this workload's increasing, and who knows, Martin, maybe you and I will have to make representations to the Attorney General and basically encourage the government to increase the in terms of the number of resources at the NACC, so that we can actually ensure that all of these cases are investigated thoroughly and properly, and then we can actually start to put people away who have been perverting the public interest and public policy.
Well, certainly I'm interested in not so much at the top of the hopper. It's good to see stuff coming in, but I want to actually see when we actually see something coming out the bottom of the hopper, and specific individuals and maybe entities get hauled over the coals. Because, frankly, until we get to that stage, this is just so much smoke and mirrors, right? Until it actually hits the ground, until we actually see people taken to jail or whatever it is. That's what I'm looking for. And I suspect we're going to have to wait quite a long time, because traditionally these processes tend to grind over months, not weeks. And with that hopper filling above, it could be quite some time before we see real consequences in the real world. But it's important that we do.
Yes. The one thing I'll just leave the audience with a bit of a thought, Martin, is that if people want to know which bodies or agencies are covered by the NACC, so the Department of Finance publishes what they call a flip chart, and the flip chart has a list of all the Commonwealth bodies that are covered by the a piece of legislation called the Public Governance Performance and Accountability Act 2013. And so anyone can look up in terms of this flip chart, and we'll actually just put it up on the screen for people to be able to have a look. And the interesting thing about this flip chart, Martin, is that one of the interesting bodies which is covered by the NACC, which is very unique in Australian history, is actually the ABC. So there's no state or territory government entity that actually does public media. And so the only public media entity in Australia is the ABC. And obviously, because it's a Commonwealth non-corporate body, it's actually now encapsulated in terms of the NACC. And so it's going to be interesting to see if anything comes in terms of the what happens at the ABC, because obviously something that you and I have talked about historically with the BBC in the UK is Jimmy Savile and the systemic cover-up of his now well-documented pedophilia activity. And so if certain people at the public broadcaster have engaged in criminal acts against, say, children, and that has been systemically suppressed for whatever reason, like it has in the UK with Jimmy Savile, maybe the NACC will have something to say about those types of behaviours if they were to surface in the Australian context.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I guess we'll have to wait and see. But to my mind, public broadcasters do have an obligation and responsibility, and you sometimes wonder how the editorial decisions are made and what gets covered and what doesn't get covered. So that's a whole new can of worms, John, isn't it?
Yes, and well, the only thing I can probably say about public broadcasting is I think the public at large have sometimes very big disagreements in terms of the types of content that a public broadcaster would put to air. But in my view, I think if there are circumstances where it can be demonstrated that a public broadcaster knowingly put fake information to air to push some sort of political agenda or to advance interests of the intelligence services, that could constitute corruption, because you're using public money to basically betray the public interest by lying to the public. So public broadcasting and an anti-corruption body, I think this is going to be a very interesting mix. And I don't think the BBC in the UK is subject to any form of oversight by an anti-corruption body. So this is going to be a very interesting area as to, will ABC journalists be scrutinized for their journalistic work? And if they were to be found to knowingly put false information to air, would that constitute corruption or not? Because I think there's a whole plethora of our audience that would have deep concerns or will take issue with some of the programming that the ABC has put to air over the last, say, 5 or 10 years.
Yes, and of course there's a difference between editorial judgment and balanced coverage, and coverage that might actually be precipitated because of some external force which isn't necessarily declared. And in that situation, corruption could exist.
Exactly. So, Martin, in terms of, in conclusion, the silent revolution in Canberra continues. More and more targets are being identified. We have 13 new targets who have been correctly accused of corruption that are now needing to be investigated, and it'll be again fascinating to see how this new body is able to clean out the system. Because I think, as we can tell from our last show, there's a lot of our audience who think that the system is rotten to the core.
Absolutely, John. Well, we'll keep pressing, of course, and come back with more information. So thanks for that. And we'll be back next time for yet more updates on this very important subject. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.